Welcome back to the Simulator series. In today's episode, we're going to be creating the offline clicker. Now, before we hop directly into Studio, we're actually going to go to our creator dashboard, go to our experience, because we want to add a brand new game pass. Now, of course, from the overview of our game, we're going to go to associated items, then we'll click on passes, and then we'll create a brand new pass. Now, the name of this pass is going to be double offline clicker, and the description is going to say doubles the amount of clicks you receive while offline. We'll then go ahead and click on create pass. Now that we've created that pass, let's go ahead and make sure that we put that on sale. So we're going to go over to the sales on the left side of the screen, set the item for sale, and then we'll just set the price in Robux to 1. We'll make sure that we save our changes, and now that's all good to go. The last thing that we really need to do is go back to our passes tab. When we hover over the game pass, we can see these 3 dots right here. Let's go ahead and click on that, and then click copy asset ID, because we're going to need the asset ID to add to our shop config file that we've made previously. And with that being said, we can now hop directly into Roblox Studio. So hopping directly into Studio, the first thing that we're going to actually do is add that game pass that we just created to our shop config. So let's go to the replicated storage inside of the configs folder, and then we're going to go ahead and open up the shop module script. Inside of here, we're going to scroll all the way down until we see our game passes table. Then I'm going to go all the way to the bottom of this table where we have all of our IDs. I'm going to create another table, then I'm going to say ID equals, and I'm going to add a brand new ID. And now that we've added that, that's all that we have to do inside of here, so we can go ahead and save it and close this script. And now that we've created the game pass as well as added it to our config, let's go ahead and start off by creating the offline clicker GUI. Now, in order to begin creating this GUI, we're going to go inside of the starter GUI and then just start off with a base plate rather than creating every single element once again. Let's go ahead and actually duplicate the settings screen GUI, and then we'll rename this to be called offline clicker. Once we've done that, let's go ahead and make it enabled. Then we'll expand it and we'll start off by resizing the frame. Now, for the size of this, on the X scale, I'm going to go with 0.35, and on the Y scale, I'm going to go with 0.5. That makes it a little bit larger. Then inside of the frame, we have the title text label. Let's go ahead and set the text of this to say offline clicker, and then we can go ahead and actually delete the container frame. The next thing that we'll do is duplicate the title text label, and we'll drag it down just a tiny bit. We'll then rename this to be called Subtitle, and for the font, we want to adjust the style to not be bold. Now, for the text of this, we're going to say earn clicks at a 10% rate of your click multiplier each second while you are offline. Then we'll go ahead and resize this a little bit, and we'll just make it a little bit larger. And I'm also going to make it a little bit wider as well. So I think for the sizing, that's pretty good. Let's then go ahead and make sure that we center this horizontally. And now that's looking pretty good. We'll then duplicate the subtitle text label, and we'll rename this one to be called amount. We'll then also drag that down a little bit. And for the text of this, we're going to say something like 99.99M clicks earned. So this text label is going to display the amount of clicks that the player has earned while they've been offline. For the font of this, we're going to make this bold, and then we're also going to resize it a little bit, mostly vertically. So I think that's pretty good. And then we might want to drag this down a little bit and reposition it. Of course, let's make sure that it is centered horizontally, which it is, so that's good to go. Next, what we'll do is create the button which players can click on to purchase the Game Pass. So we'll go ahead and duplicate the exit text button, and then we'll try to drag it down a little bit. Of course, we moved the text label on accident, but that's perfectly fine. We'll just recenter it in a bit. Now that we've dragged it down towards the bottom of the GUI, let's also resize it as well. So I think that sizing's pretty good. It's just a little bit larger than the amount text label. Let's of course make sure that we center this horizontally as well, and now that's looking good. Let's also rename this to be called Game Pass, and then we'll adjust the background color of this as well, and we're going to make that a nice kind of brightish green. Now, I'm going to actually go ahead and delete this X text label. Instead of having that, I'm going to duplicate the title text label and put that inside of the button. Then I'm going to resize this a tiny bit, making it a little bit taller. And for the text of this, we're going to say in all capital letters, double offline clicker, as that's the name of our Game Pass. And for the text X alignment, we're going to set this to left. Now that we've done that, let's go ahead and drag this, and we basically want to position it at the top left corner of the button. We then also want to add a UI stroke inside of here as well. And for the thickness, we're going to go with about 3. Now, I think that's looking pretty good. We might want to resize it a little bit, maybe make it a little bit longer, and maybe even just bring it down a tiny bit as well so that it's not touching the top or touching the left-hand side as well. But now that we have that, let's go ahead and duplicate the title text label inside of this button. Then we'll rename this one to be called Price. And for the text of this, we're going to say something like 299 R and then the money symbol to indicate that it costs 299 Robux. Now we want to position this towards the bottom right corner of the button. So first, let's go ahead and set the text X alignment to right. So now the text appears towards the right. And then let's also decrease the size of this a little bit as well. So now this is what we got for the position. And I think that looks pretty nice. It's appearing at the bottom right corner, not touching either of the sides. Now the only other change that I really want to make to this is adjusting the UI stroke. And I actually want to change the line join mode from round to either milter or bevel, which I think I'm going to go with bevel. And now that we've done that, I think we're good for the price text label. Let's go ahead and duplicate this one more time. We'll move it over a tiny bit and we'll rename this to be called description. Now for the text of this, we're going to say say double your offline clicker amount. And then we'll also resize it as well. Now, along with that, we're actually going to set the text X alignment back over to left. And then for the position, we're actually going to go ahead and grab the X position from the title text label that we have inside of here, so that both the title text label and the description text label are lined up together. Now, I'm also going to make this text label a tiny bit smaller as well. And then inside of here, I'm going to go ahead and delete that UI stroke. Along with that, I'm going to change the font of this to no longer be bold. And now I think that looks pretty good, but I want to make it just a tiny bit taller so that we can see the text a tiny bit more. And then I think I'll stretch it out a tiny bit as well. So now for the description, this is the size that we ended up with, and this is the position that we ended up with as well. And with all that being said, I think the only other change that I want to make is actually to just make the background color of the Game Pass button slightly darker. And the reason I'm doing that is because the green that we were using was more of a lighter color, and when you have white text on a lighter color like that, it can be a little hard to read the white text over top of that background because they're both light colors. So now that we've made it darker, I think that makes everything much easier to read, especially the description. So now that we've created the GUI, let's get to scripting it. In order to begin scripting this, we're going to actually start off by adding in the player data. Now, the only player data that we're actually going to use here is for tracking the time of when the player has last logged off. And of course, the reason that we're doing this is because how our auto clicker is going to work is since the last time that the player has logged off, we need to do some calculations to determine the amount of clicks that they should receive for the duration of them being offline. So whenever the player is leaving our game, we want to store the time at that current moment into the player's data so that when they log back in, we can then do some calculations to determine how many clicks they should receive. So in order to add this player data, we're going to go inside of the replicated storage, inside of the player data folder, and open up the template module script. Inside of here, we're going to scroll all the way down to the bottom. Once we get to the bottom, of course, we have our template variable, and directly below the badges key, we're going to go ahead and add another key, which is going to be called offline, and we're simply going to set that to 0. Now that we've set it to 0, that's all that we have to do inside of this template, but let's also go ahead and implement updating that data whenever the player leaves the game. Now, in order to do that, we need to go inside of the server script service, inside of the player data folder, and open up the data server script. Inside of here, we can scroll down pretty far, and one of the last things that we do inside of the script is connect to the player removing event. Inside of here is where we fetch the player's profile, and if we are actually able to get the player's profile, then we go ahead and release it because that's what the profile service requires us to do. Now, right before we release the player's profile, let's go ahead and update the value of that offline key that we just added to the player's data. So to do this, we're going to go inside of the if statement. So if we do find the profile, then we know that we could actually update that data. So we're going to say profile.data, and then we want to index that with offline. And we're going to set the value of this equal to os.time, which of course would give us the current time. And now the reason that we're specifically handling this inside of the data script is because it could be a little bit unreliable to do this in another script. And the reason for that is because if we were to listen to the player removing event, there's a chance that the profile could be released before we're able to update the value of the offline key. So that's why we want to do it inside of here so that we can guarantee that we're able to do that directly before we actually release the profile. Like I said, if we were to listen to the player removing event in another script and then do the exact same thing here, like setting this data, there's a chance that the player's profile could have already been released, so this data would not get updated or set. And now with that being said, we can go ahead and close out of the data script. Now the next thing that we're going to do is go ahead and create the offline clicker config because we want to share a couple of functions between the server and the client. So let's go inside of the replicated storage, inside of the configs folder, and go ahead and add in a brand new module script. Of course, we'll rename this module script to be called offline clicker. And for the actual module variable, we'll just go ahead and call this clicker. So let's go ahead and rename both those variables. Now inside of here, we're going to go ahead and create a variable for the replicated storage. And we also have to get some modules as well. So one of the modules that we need to get is our stats module, which is inside of the replicated storage, inside of the utils folder, and that module is called stats. We then also need to get the shop config as well, which is inside of the configs folder, and that module is called shop. Let's also rename this variable to be called shop config. Awesome. Now that we've done that, let's go ahead and start creating some of our shared functions. So we're going to create a function and we'll say clicker dot. And now the name of this function is going to be called getMultiplier. This is going to have one parameter, which is going to be the player's data. Now inside of here, what we want to do is we want to check if the player owns the double offline clicker game pass that we created. If they do own the Game Pass, then we want to set the multiplier to 20% because by default, the player will get 10% of their click multiplier. But if they purchase the Game Pass, we want to double that. So instead of giving them 10%, we want to give them 20% of their click multiplier. So in order to check if the player owns the Game Pass, we want to go ahead and get the Game Pass ID. So we'll say shopconfig.get Game Pass ID from name. And the name that we want to pass through to here is called double offline clicker. Then we want to go ahead and create a variable called hasGamePass and check if the player does actually own the Game Pass or not. So we'll pass through the Game Pass ID as well as the player's data. And now that we know if the player has the Game Pass or not, let's go ahead and create a variable called Multiplier, which again, if the player does have the Game Pass, then the multiplier should be 0.20 because that would be 20%. Otherwise, it should be 0.1 as that would be 10%. And after we determine the multiplier, we then want to go ahead and return it. Cool. So that function was pretty simple to make. Now we'll go ahead and create another one. And this is going to be called calculate offline clicks, which is going to have two parameters. The first parameter is going to be the player, and the second parameter will be the player's data. We'll then start off by creating a variable called multiplier. And of course, to get the multiplier, we're going to use the function that we just created earlier. So get multiplier, and we'll pass through the player's data. Now that we have the offline click multiplier, we also need to get the player's click multiplier as well. So we'll say local click multiplier equals, and now to get the player's click multiplier, we need to use the stats module. So we'll say stats.click multiplier. We'll pass through the player, and we'll also pass through their data as well. Now that we have both of these multipliers, which honestly, we could kind of just put them together, what we then want to do is create a variable for the last time the player has logged out, and then we'll also create a variable for the current time as well. So we'll say last login, and that's going to be equal to data.offline, because remember, we just added that offline key to the player's data, and then we'll create a variable called current time, which is going to be equal to os.time. Then we want to calculate the amount of seconds since the player has last logged in. Now, another thing that I'm thinking here is that we could probably rename the last login variable to last offline or last logged out, as that's more specific and probably correct. But also, in my opinion, if I saw a variable named last logged out, I feel like that's a very weird variable name, so part of me really doesn't want to rename it to that, but if you think that works better for you, then certainly feel free to do that. Anyways, I'm going to create another variable. This variable is going to be called seconds since last login, and that's going to be equal to the current time, and we're going to subtract the last login time from the current time. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is create a variable called clicks, and now we'll actually calculate the clicks. Rather than just flat out calculating the clicks, we're actually going to use a function from the math library, which is called floor. And the reason that we're using this is because this will give us a whole number rather than possibly being a decimal. So now inside of here, we'll actually do all of our calculations. And what we're going to do is we're going to multiply the seconds since last login by the click multiplier multiplied by the multiplier. Now keep in mind that I do have these inside of parentheses, and I'd recommend that you make those as well. Although again, if you've watched this far, you probably understand that I'm not great at math, so sometimes I will include parentheses when they are not required. Man, all those years going through math class, I never, ever thought in my life that I would ever actually have to use it, and it's shocking that I got into one of the only professions where knowing these things about math is actually used. So sorry for that little side tangent, but hey kids, if you're watching this video and you're still in school and you want to be a programmer, pay attention in school because this is a fair example as to where you might actually use those skills in the real world. Anyways, with that all being said, now that we've actually calculated the amount of clicks that the player should get, let's go ahead and return the clicks variable. Am I the only one who looks at the blank spaces between variables and just overanalyzes them? I don't know. Part of me is just really kind of cringing seeing that separation, which I feel like this makes more sense. We're keeping all the time variables together, then we have the clicks variable just above the return statement. Sorry, I don't feel like I actually have OCD, but man, that was just bugging me to see those not really grouped together that well. But I feel like this is now perfect in my opinion, although I feel like the higher level programmers might completely disagree with me and feel like the organization should be completely separate, but I don't know, I just can't help it. This looks good in my eyes, but hey, to each their own, right? Anyways, with all that being said, we're now done with the clicker module and we can go ahead and close out of that. So the next thing we'll do is start scripting this on the server side. In order to do that, we'll go inside of the server script service and we'll create a brand new script. We'll go ahead and rename this to be called offline clicker as well. Now inside of here, we'll of course need to create a couple of variables. So we're going to want to create a variable for the player service, the replicated storage service, as well as the server script service. In addition to that, we want to create a variable for the offline clicker config that we just created, which is inside of the replicated storage, inside of the configs folder. And then we also want to create a variable for the player data manager as well, which is inside of the server script service and inside of the player data folder. Now, this script is actually going to be really small and really simple. What we want to do is listen for the profile loaded event to be fired off, which is stored inside of the player data module. So we'll say .event, and then we'll connect that to a function. Now let's go ahead and create that function, and this function is going to be called collect clicks. This is going to accept a player, which of course is a player, as well as their data. So now that we've just created that function, let's go ahead and connect this event to that function, just like that. So now whenever the player's profile is loaded in, this function will be called and the player as well as their data will be passed through to it. Now, there's actually something that we want to do before we reward the player their clicks. We actually want to check if this is the first time that the player has logged into the game. If this is the first time that the player has joined our game, then we don't even need to calculate the amount of clicks that they deserve because of course they've never been offline yet. So why would they deserve any clicks? So the first thing that we'll do is create a variable called first login, which is going to be equal to data.offline. And if the value of that is equal to 0, then we know that this is the first time that they're logging in, because remember, when we set up the player's data originally, we set that value equal to 0 by default. And then as soon as they log out, that value is updated instantly. So the first time that the player joins the game, the offline value will be set to 0, but every time after that, the value of offline will never again be 0. Now that we've created that variable, if first login is true, then what we're going to do is stop the function right there. And now after that is where we can actually implement the logic for rewarding the player the amount of clicks that they deserve. So let's go ahead and get the amount of clicks that the player does deserve by creating a variable called clicks. And then from our offline clicker module, we will use the calculate offline clicks function. We'll pass through the player, and we'll pass through their data as well. And then using the player data manager, we can say player data dot adjust clicks, pass through the player, and pass through the amount of clicks as well. And now with that being said, that's actually all that we have to do on the server side. Like I said, it really is extremely simple. So now that we've implemented this on the server side, let's go ahead and implement this on the client side. So we'll go inside of the starter player, inside of the starter player scripts, inside of the GUI folder, and let's go ahead and duplicate the code's local script. Of course, we'll rename this to be called offline clicker. And the reason that we're duplicating that script is because I always like to start off with a couple of variables so that we don't have to waste our time setting them once again. Now, inside of here, we do need the replicated storage and the player service, but we also want to create a variable for the marketplace service as well. From there, we do need the state manager, but we do not need the code's config. Instead, we want to create a variable for the offline clicker config that we just created. We also want to create a variable for the format number library as well. And then we want to create a variable for the shop config as well. Now, we're not actually using any remote events, so we can delete that variable. We do need the player variable as well as the player GUI. For the GUI variable, of course, we're not actually going to use the code's GUI. We're instead going to use the offline clicker GUI. We then have our usual frame variable. After that, we have a variable for the exit button. Let's just go ahead and actually delete everything after this, except for when we connect the exit button to the mouse button one click. We can actually go ahead and leave that. But after our exit variable, we're going to go ahead and create a few more. The first variable that we're going to create is for the subtitle. So we're going to say frame.subtitle. We'll then create a variable for the Gamepass button, and I'm going to name this variable Gamepass button. And then finally, we want to create a variable for the amount text label. So we'll just call that amount. And cool, now that we've done that, we've pretty much created all the variables that we'll need. In addition to that, we already have the exit button scripted, so we can even skip over that. Now, the first thing that we want to do is script if the GUI should be visible or not. Now, realistically, the GUI should be visible almost every single time the player logs in, except for the very first time that the player logs in, of course, because the player would not have any clicks to be rewarded because it's their first time logging in. So similar to how we did on the server side, let's go ahead and create a variable called first login, which is going to be equal to the state manager.getData.offline. And if the value of that equals 0, then what we're going to do is say GUI.enabled equals not first login. So if the player is logging in for the first time, then the GUI will not be enabled. Otherwise, the GUI will be enabled every time the player logs in. After we've done that, we also need to check if we want to make the Gamepass button visible to the player, because I feel like we should only make that visible to the player if they have not purchased it yet. So of course, we need to check if they own the Game Pass or not. So let's create a variable for its Game Pass ID. And how do we get that? Well, of course, we use the shop config. We use the get Game Pass ID from name function. And the Game Pass that we're looking for is the one called double offline clicker. After we get the Game Pass ID, we then want to create a variable for if the player owns the Game Pass or not. And how do we determine that? Well, we use the does player own Game Pass function from the shop config, passing through the Game Pass ID, as well as passing through state manager.getData, just like that. So now that we've determined if the player owns the Game Pass or not, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to adjust the visibility of the Game Pass button. So we'll say GamePassButton.visible equals not owns Game Pass. So we only want to display that button if the player does not own the Game Pass. Cool, so I hope, and I think that was pretty simple and easy to follow along with. Below the exit button, let's go ahead and script clicking on the Game Pass button and purchasing the Game Pass. So we're going to say Game Pass button dot mouse button one click, connect. We'll create an anonymous function inside of here, and we're going to use the marketplace service. We'll use the prompt Game Pass purchase method. We'll pass through the player, and we'll pass through the Game Pass ID as well. So that'll prompt the player to purchase the Game Pass, and remember, the button will only be visible, so it can only be clicked upon if the player does not already own the Game Pass. And now that we've done that, let's go ahead and start creating some functions. So let's add some blank space between the first login and our amount variable. And the first function that we're going to create is going to be called update subtitle. This is not going to have any parameters. And what we want to update inside of the text of the subtitle is the percentage of clicks that the player will receive. Because remember, by default, they will receive 10%, but if they've purchased the Game Pass, then they should receive 20%. So first of all, let's go ahead and get the multiplier. So we're going to say local multiplier equals, we'll use our offline clicker module. We'll use the get multiplier function. We'll pass through the state manager.getData. And now that we get the multiplier, remember the number that's given back to us is 0.1 or 0.2. So we want to multiply that by 100 because we're displaying it to the player. And now that we have that multiplier, we want to update the text of the subtitle. And now usually I would make it a constant here, but since we're only using it in one location, what I'm going to do is copy the text directly from the subtitle text label, paste it inside of here, and then we'll just replace this number 10 with the multiplier variable. So now it'll say earn clicks at a 10% or 20% rate of your click multiplier each second while you are offline. And that's all that we have to do for this function. Now we'll go ahead and create another function. This is going to be called update clicks, and we're actually going to go ahead and update the amount text label here to display the amount of clicks that the player has earned while they've been offline. So let's go ahead and create a variable for the amount of clicks. And how do we determine that? Well, inside of the offline clicker, we have that calculate offline clicks function. Of course, we need to pass through the player as well as the state manager.getData. Then we'll update the text of the amount text label equal. And the first thing that we want to do is use format number.format. We'll pass through the amount of clicks. And then after we display the amount of clicks that the player has earned, we're going to say clicks earned just like that. So of course, this part will say 999M clicks, and then it'll say clicks earned. Awesome. And now that we've created both those functions, let's go ahead and call them. And when are we going to call them? Well, we just basically have to call them right after we've created them, actually. So we'll say update clicks, and we'll also call update subtitle as well. So when the script first loads up is when those things actually need to be updated. And that's kind of like the rest of the script here as well. We could also put these things in their own function as well, but I think they're fine to just kind of script outside of functions because they're very small and simple. Although you could say the same thing about these as well, but I don't know, I felt like putting those in functions for some reason while I didn't feel like putting these in functions for some reason. Anyways, with all that being said, we're actually done with the script, so we can go ahead and close out of that. Now, what I'd actually recommend doing is resetting your player data to make this easier to work with and see the changes that we've just made. So of course, I'll go inside of the server script service, inside of the player data folder, open up the data script, and once again, we'll go ahead and change the profile store key to something else, save the game, and then go ahead and start this up. Now, once we load into our game, we actually should not see anything from the offline clicker because again, this is the first time that we've logged into our game. But let's go ahead and click. And when we click, we can see that we're getting 4 clicks per second. So we kind of know that our click multiplier is about 4. Then let's go ahead and stop the game right there. And then we'll start it up once again. Now we have our loading screen going. And then as soon as the loading screen actually finishes, we can see the offline clicker GUI. And we see that we're earning clicks at a 20% rate of your click multiplier each second while you are offline. So it says that we've earned 9 clicks, and it does automatically give it to us as well. You might want to add a collect button here, and you certainly can do that. But personally, when I script things like this, even say the random reward that players get, I always like to give the player the actual reward without forcing them to click the claim button. And the reason for that is because I never really want the player to miss a reward simply because they forgot to click on a button to redeem that reward, but I can certainly see reasons of why you'd want to force them to click the button in order to receive the reward. With that being said though, if you've made it up to this far in the series, you will probably be able to implement a collection button on your own. And if not, you can always ask for help in the Discord to do that because I imagine there are other people who would also want to do that as well. Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, with all that being said, that's going to be it for this episode. As always, if you did enjoy, smash the like button. And of course, feel free to go ahead and support me on Patreon so you can get access to all the scripts and the game file that I made during this episode. With that being said, I hope you guys have a great day, and I'll see you guys in the next episode.